The destruction of the One Ring is one of the most pivotal moments in the history of Middle-earth, marking the culmination of a struggle that spanned millennia. The One Ring, forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom, was not merely a tool for domination, it was the very essence of Sauron's power and being. When Frodo Baggins, aided by the resilience and bravery of Samwise Gamgee, finally brought the ring to the heart of Mordor, it set the stage for an event that would forever change the course of history. As the ring fell into the molten lava of Mount Doom, the chain of events that had been set in motion long before Sauron's rise to power finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The destruction of the ring was not just a physical act, it was the undoing of Sauron's most carefully crafted work, the unraveling of the intricate web of deceit, power, and domination that he had spun over the ages. The moment the ring was consumed by the fire, the power that Sauron had poured into it was released in a cataclysmic burst, breaking his hold over Middle-earth. The immediate consequence of the ring's destruction was the annihilation of Sauron's physical form. Throughout his long existence, Sauron had taken on many shapes and guises, from the fair form of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, to the fearsome Dark Lord clad in black armor. But all these forms were mere manifestations of his will, powered by the strength that the One Ring provided. When the ring was unmade, so too was his ability to maintain a physical presence in the world. In that instant, the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr, which had stood as a symbol of Sauron's might for over 2,000 years, began to crumble. The eye of Sauron, ever watchful and piercing, faltered and then vanished as the Dark Lord's presence was ripped from the physical realm. The destruction of the ring triggered the collapse of Barad-dûr in a spectacular and violent manner. The towering fortress, which had been built with the aid of the ring's power, could not withstand the sudden loss of its dark energy source. Stones that had been impervious to any assault began to crack and split, and the very foundations of the tower were torn apart. The sky above Mordor, once thick with the fumes and darkness that spewed from Mount Doom, began to clear as the oppressive presence of Sauron dissipated. The earthquakes that shook the land as Barad-dûr fell were not just physical tremors, but the echoes of a dark power being undone. Sauron's defeat was not just a physical collapse, it was a metaphysical one. Sauron, once a Maya of Aule, had poured so much of his essence into the ring that its destruction left him in a state of utter ruin. He had become the ring in a sense, and with its destruction, his spirit was left shattered and dispersed. Unlike in previous defeats, such as at the end of the Second Age when he lost the ring but retained the ability to manifest himself, this time there was no coming back. His spirit was banished to the shadows, unable to ever take form again. The fall of Sauron was also the fall of an era. For nearly 3,000 years, Sauron had been the shadow that loomed over Middle-earth, first in the guise of a benevolent guide to the Elves, and later as the tyrant of Mordor. His influence had shaped the history of the world, causing wars, corrupting hearts, and driving even the mightiest of realms to despair. But in that moment, with the ring's destruction, all of Sauron's schemes, all his ambitions were undone. The world was free of his dominion for the first time in an age, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the free peoples was lifted. However, the end of Sauron was not a simple vanishing act. The destruction of the ring and the collapse of his physical form did not mean that Sauron ceased to exist entirely. His spirit, though formless and stripped of all power, lingered as a shadow of its former self. He was now a being of pure malice, unable to exert any influence on the world, but still aware of his defeat, still conscious of his failure. In this state, Sauron was no longer a threat to Middle-earth, but his presence was a reminder of the evil that had once nearly consumed the world. The world that Sauron left behind was one that was fundamentally changed. The great armies he had amassed, orcs, trolls, and men who had sworn fealty to him, found themselves leaderless, their morale shattered by the loss of their master. The alliances that Sauron had forged through fear and domination crumbled as swiftly as Barad-dûr itself. In the lands of Gondor and Rohan, where the armies of the West had fought valiantly against Sauron's forces, the sense of relief was palpable, but so too was the awareness that the victory had come at a great cost. For the people of Middle-earth, Sauron's defeat was a moment of both triumph and reflection. The ring, which had caused so much suffering and death, was gone, and with it the last remnant of Sauron's power. But the scars left by his long reign would take time to heal. The land of Mordor, once a barren wasteland twisted by Sauron's malice, would begin to recover, though it would never fully return to its former state. The realms of men, elves, and dwarves, having endured the darkness of Sauron's rule, would now enter a new era, an era free from the shadow of the Dark Lord, but one where the lessons of his rise and fall would not be forgotten. The destruction of the One Ring was the final chapter in Sauron's long and dark history, a history that had been marked by his insatiable lust for power and his desire to dominate all life in Middle-earth. But in the end, it was his own creation, the very object that he had intended to be the key to his ultimate victory, that led to his undoing. The moment the ring melted away in the fires of Mount Doom was the moment that Sauron, the Dark Lord, was finally and irrevocably defeated. The destruction of the One Ring had profound implications for Sauron, not only in the immediate physical collapse of his form and fortress, but also in the more profound dissipation of his power. To understand the full extent of Sauron's defeat, it's essential to grasp the nature of his power and how it was intrinsically tied to the ring. This chapter delves into the metaphysical consequences of the ring's destruction and how it led to the unraveling of Sauron's influence over Middle-earth. Sauron was not an ordinary being. He was a Maya, a lesser Ainur, created by Eru Ilúvatar at the beginning of time. The Maiar were powerful spirits, lesser in might only to the Valar, and each had unique abilities and domains. Sauron, originally known as Myron, was a Maya of Aule the Smith, one of the Valar. He was skilled in the arts of craftsmanship and had a natural affinity for order, structure, and control. However, this desire for order and perfection eventually led to his downfall, as he was seduced by the dark power and vision of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. When Morgoth was finally overthrown at the end of the First Age, Sauron evaded capture and slowly began to rebuild his strength in secret. Over time, he came to see himself as the rightful heir to Morgoth's legacy, and he devised a plan to dominate all of Middle-earth through the creation of the One Ring. Unlike Morgoth, who sought to corrupt and destroy, Sauron's ambitions were more refined. He desired to control, to bend the wills of others to his own. The One Ring was the perfect instrument for this purpose. By forging the ring, Sauron poured a significant portion of his own native power into it, binding his fate to that of the ring. The One Ring was not just a powerful artifact, it was an extension of Sauron's very essence. Through it, he could exert his influence over the other rings of power, and by extension, over the rulers who wore them. This is why the ring was so dangerous. It had the power to corrupt anyone who possessed it, drawing them closer to Sauron's will. But this also meant that Sauron had made himself vulnerable in a way that Morgoth never had. By investing so much of his power into a single object, Sauron created a weakness that could be exploited. If the ring were destroyed, so too would his power be. When the ring was finally destroyed, the power that Sauron had invested in it was released in a sudden and catastrophic burst. The metaphysical bond that connected Sauron to the ring was severed, and with it his ability to control and influence the world around him. This wasn't merely a loss of power in the conventional sense, it was the unraveling of Sauron's very being. The ring had become so intertwined with Sauron's essence that its destruction left him spiritually broken. His power was dissipated, scattered like dust in the wind, leaving him a shadow of his former self. In the moments following the ring's destruction, the effects of this dissipation were immediate and far-reaching. The Nazgul, Sauron's most feared servants, who had been bound to him through their own rings of power, were instantly obliterated. Without the ring to sustain their existence, they were consumed by the very forces that had kept them alive for so long. These ring-wraiths, once mortal kings, had been reduced to mere extensions of Sauron's will, and with the dissolution of that will, they were finally released from their torment, albeit in a manner that led to their complete annihilation. The impact on Sauron's other servants was no less severe. The orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures that had been bred and controlled by Sauron felt the immediate loss of his guiding will. These creatures were not naturally inclined to organize themselves or to fight with the cohesion that Sauron's influence had imposed on them. Without his power to bind them, they fell into chaos, turning on each other or fleeing in disarray. The great armies that had once threatened to overwhelm the free peoples of Middle-earth disbanded almost overnight, their cohesion shattered. But the dissipation of Sauron's power was more than just the loss of his armies and servants. It represented the end of an era of darkness and fear that had gripped Middle-earth for centuries. Sauron's influence had been felt far beyond the borders of Mordor. It had corrupted men, twisted the hearts of rulers, and sown discord across the world. With his power dissipated, the shadows that had hung over Middle-earth began to lift. The lands that had been scarred by his malice and his wars started to heal, though the process would take many years, and in some places, the damage would never be fully undone. The dissipation of Sauron's power also had profound implications for the spiritual and metaphysical balance of Middle-earth. Sauron had been a dark counterbalance to the forces of good, a remnant of the evil that Morgoth had brought into the world. With his power broken, that balance shifted. The forces of good, represented by the Valar, the Elves, and the other free peoples of Middle-earth, found themselves no longer in direct opposition to a dark power of such magnitude. This shift signaled the beginning of the end for the Age of the Elves and the dawn of the dominion of men, who would now take on the responsibility of shaping the future of the world. Yet, despite his defeat, Sauron's spirit was not entirely destroyed. Unlike Morgoth, who was cast into the void, Sauron's spirit lingered, a formless, powerless shadow. This was the ultimate fate of Sauron, a being of immense malice, reduced to a state of impotence, aware of his defeat but unable to influence the world any longer. Sauron's spirit was now a mere wraith of what it once was, a ghostly presence in the world, forever bound to the ruins of his ambitions. This existence was a kind of living death, a state of perpetual frustration and bitterness, knowing that he had come so close to ultimate victory, only to be undone by the very thing he had created to secure it. In this diminished state, Sauron no longer posed a direct threat to Middle-earth, but his presence was a lingering reminder of the darkness that had once nearly engulfed the world. The dissipation of his power marked the end of the Second Dark Lord, but it also left a legacy of caution. The peoples of Middle-earth would remain vigilant, knowing that evil, once unleashed, could never be entirely eradicated, only contained and resisted. The end of Sauron's power also had a symbolic significance for the world. It represented the victory of hope over despair, of light over darkness. The destruction of the ring and the dissipation of Sauron's power were not just the defeat of a tyrant, but the triumph of the courage, resilience, and unity of the free peoples of Middle-earth. It was a victory that had been hard-won, and it served as a testament to the strength of those who had resisted Sauron's influence, even when all seemed lost. The legacy of Sauron's dissipation would endure in the memories and histories of Middle-earth. The tales of his rise and fall would be told and retold, serving as a warning to future generations about the dangers of unchecked power and the corrupting influence of evil. But they would also serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and that even the most powerful of evils can be defeated by the courage of the few who stand against it. In the end, the dissipation of Sauron's power was not just the end of a tyrant, but the beginning of a new era for Middle-earth. It was an era where the shadows had been banished, where the lands could begin to heal, and where the people of Middle-earth could look to the future with renewed hope. Sauron, once the most feared and powerful being in the world, was now nothing more than a whisper in the dark, a shadow that would fade into history, leaving behind only the lessons learned from his rise and fall. The fall of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring had a cascading effect on all those who had served or been bound to him. Sauron's vast armies, his most loyal servants, and even the land of Mordor itself were deeply intertwined with his power. The sudden dissipation of that power led to an immediate and profound change in their fates, which were as varied as they were tragic. The most immediate and dramatic consequence of Sauron's defeat was the fate of the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths. Once kings of men, these 9 had been enslaved to Sauron's will through the rings of power he had given them. Over time, the power of the One Ring bound them completely to Sauron, stripping them of their physical forms and turning them into spectral entities, neither living nor dead, wholly dependent on Sauron's existence. The destruction of the One Ring was not just the end of Sauron's dominion over them, it was their end as well. The Nazgul were obliterated in a cataclysmic release of energy, as Sauron's power was broken. They were consumed by the same forces that had sustained them for so long, their spirits finally released from the torment of their undead existence. For centuries, they had been Sauron's most feared enforcers, but in the end, they were nothing without the dark power that had bound them to their master. Beyond the Nazgul, Sauron's vast armies were left leaderless and directionless in the wake of his downfall. The forces of Mordor were comprised of a variety of creatures, each more dreadful than the last. Orcs, the backbone of Sauron's army, were creatures of malice and violence, bred for war and conquest. Under Sauron's influence, they had fought with a ferocious unity, driven by their fear of him and their hatred of all things good. However, with Sauron's defeat, the unifying force that had held these creatures together was gone. The orcs, once a formidable and organized force, fell into disarray. Without the constant oppressive presence of their master, their natural tendencies towards chaos and infighting took over. In the immediate aftermath, many orcs turned on each other, settling old scores and fighting for survival in a world that no longer had a place for them. The trolls, another of Sauron's monstrous creations, faced a similar fate. These hulking brutes, bred for their immense strength and terrifying appearance, were often used as shock troops in Sauron's wars. Like the orcs, trolls were creatures of darkness, and without Sauron's guiding hand, they too were left without purpose. In the chaos that followed the collapse of Mordor, many trolls wandered aimlessly, their simple minds unable to comprehend the full scope of what had happened. Some were hunted down by the armies of the West, while others retreated to the dark places of the world, where they would eventually fade into legend. Sauron's human allies, the Easterlings and the Southrons, were also profoundly affected by his defeat. These men had been drawn into Sauron's service through a combination of fear, greed, and the promise of power. The Southrons, also known as the Haradrim, were fierce warriors from the deserts of Harad, while the Easterlings hailed from the vast lands east of Mordor. Both groups had long histories of enmity with the kingdoms of the West, and Sauron had exploited these grievances to forge alliances with them. However, with Sauron's downfall, the political and military structures that had supported these alliances began to unravel. The Southrons, who had marched to war under the banner of the Great Eye, found themselves leaderless and demoralized. Many were cut down in the final battles of the War of the Ring, their once proud armies shattered by the forces of Gondor and Rohan. In the aftermath, the survivors faced the harsh reality that the power they had aligned themselves with was gone. The Southrons, who had hoped to expand their territories and wealth through their alliance with Sauron, now faced a future of uncertainty and potential retribution from the victorious West. The Easterlings, too, were left in a precarious position. These tribes and kingdoms had been united under Sauron's influence, but they had never truly been a cohesive force. Their alliance was one of convenience and coercion, and with Sauron gone, old rivalries and conflicts resurfaced. Some Easterlings attempted to flee back to their homelands, while others were captured or killed by the forces of the West. Those who survived would return to their lands with the bitter knowledge that they had fought and lost for a Dark Lord who was now nothing more than a memory. The fate of Mordor itself was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The land had been shaped by Sauron's will, a barren volcanic wasteland where nothing good could grow. It had served as the heart of his power, a fortress from which he had launched his wars against Middle-earth. With Sauron's defeat, the land of Mordor began to change. The dark clouds that had hung over the region for centuries began to dissipate, allowing sunlight to pierce through for the first time in ages. The once imposing fortress of Barad-dûr was reduced to rubble, its foundations shattered by the destruction of the One Ring. The land, now free from the corrupting influence of its master, began a slow process of healing. However, Mordor would remain a place of desolation for many years, haunted by the remnants of Sauron's evil. The orcs and other dark creatures that had inhabited Mordor found themselves without direction or hope. Many of them fled into the mountains or other remote places, seeking refuge from the wrath of the free peoples. However, without Sauron's power to sustain them, these creatures began to dwindle. Some orcs tried to carve out small kingdoms of their own, but these efforts were doomed to failure. The orcs were creatures of corruption, incapable of building anything lasting without the malevolent will of a dark master to guide them. Over time, their numbers would dwindle, and they would fade into obscurity, becoming little more than a dark memory in the annals of history. The fall of Sauron also had significant implications for the broader geopolitical landscape of Middle-earth. The kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan, which had borne the brunt of Sauron's assault, emerged victorious but deeply scarred. The victory over Sauron did not mean an immediate return to peace and prosperity. Both kingdoms had suffered heavy losses, and the process of rebuilding would take years, if not decades. The remnants of Sauron's forces, though disorganized and leaderless, still posed a threat, and the free peoples would need to remain vigilant to ensure that no new dark power rose to take Sauron's place. For the Elves, Sauron's defeat marked the beginning of the end of their time in Middle-earth. The destruction of the One Ring signaled the diminishing of the power of the three elven rings, which had been made without Sauron's direct influence, but were still tied to the fate of the One Ring. With the One Ring gone, the elves' ability to preserve and protect their realms waned. Many elves, sensing the end of their era, began to depart Middle-earth for the Undying Lands. The defeat of Sauron was a bittersweet victory for them, marking the end of an age but also the fading of their own influence in the world. The dwarves, too, felt the impact of Sauron's defeat. While they had not been as directly involved in the War of the Ring as the men of Gondor and Rohan, they had fought their own battles against Sauron's forces in the north. With Sauron gone, the dwarves saw an opportunity to reclaim some of their lost glory and rebuild their ancient kingdoms. However, they also understood that the world was changing, and that their role in it would be different from what it had been in ages past. The free peoples of Middle-earth, though victorious, were left to deal with the consequences of the Long War. Sauron's defeat did not mean the end of all evil, but it did mean the end of an era of darkness that had threatened to consume the world. The fates of Sauron's servants, his armies, and the land of Mordor itself were all part of the broader tapestry of Middle-earth's history, a history that would be shaped by the choices made in the aftermath of the Dark Lord's fall. In the end, the fall of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring marked a turning point for Middle-earth. The dark forces that had once seemed unstoppable were scattered and broken, their power dissipated along with their masters. The world was free to move forward, but it would never forget the shadow that had nearly claimed it. The survivors of the war would carry the memory of Sauron's tyranny with them, a reminder of the cost of complacency and the need for vigilance against the return of darkness. The destruction of the One Ring marked the end of Sauron's physical and spiritual dominance over Middle-earth, but the implications of this event rippled far beyond the immediate collapse of his forces and realm. The defeat of Sauron signaled a profound shift in the balance of power within Middle-earth, setting in motion the gradual decline of the ancient races, elves, dwarves, and even the Maiar, and the rise of men as the dominant force in the world. This transition was not just a change in political or military power. It represented a fundamental alteration in the very nature of Middle-earth, heralding the dawn of a new age. For the Elves, the destruction of the One Ring and the fall of Sauron were bittersweet victories. The Elves had long been the custodians of the ancient wisdom and beauty of Middle-earth, their realms like Rivendell and Lothlorien shining beacons of light and hope in a world often overshadowed by darkness. Yet, the victory over Sauron also marked the beginning of the end for the Elves in Middle-earth. The three elven rings, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, were tied to the power of the One Ring, and with its destruction, the power of these rings was diminished as well. These rings had been used by their bearers, Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf, to preserve their realms from the decay of time and to protect them from the taint of Sauron's influence. With the One Ring gone, the enchantments woven by the elven rings began to fade, and the beauty and protection they had provided started to diminish. This fading was not only a physical one, but also a spiritual and emotional reality for the Elves. Their time in Middle-earth had always been limited, a grace period granted to them by the Valar after the fall of Morgoth. With the end of Sauron, the last great enemy of the Free Peoples, their task was completed. The longing for the undying lands, which had always been present in the hearts of the Elves, grew stronger. Many Elves, especially those who had witnessed the great battles of the Second and Third Ages, felt an increasing pull to leave Middle-earth and sail to Valinor, the realm of eternal peace and light across the sea. This was not just a physical journey, but a departure from the world they had long protected and nurtured. The Elves' departure marked the end of an era, the fading of the firstborn who had walked Middle-earth since its creation. As they left, they took with them the last remnants of the ancient wisdom, beauty, and power that had shaped the early ages of the world. The forests of Lothlorien, once vibrant with the presence of Galadriel and her ring, began to lose their luster. The great halls of Rivendell, where Elrond had maintained a sanctuary of learning and refuge, became quiet as the Elves prepared to depart. The loss of the Elves left a void in Middle-earth, one that could never truly be filled. For they were a people who had seen the light of the two trees, who had spoken with the Valar, and who had witnessed the shaping of the world. The dwarves, too, were affected by the changes brought about by Sauron's fall, though in different ways. The dwarves had always been a more insular race, focused on their own realms and treasures. Yet, the wars against Sauron had forced them to engage more directly with the outside world, particularly in their alliance with the men of the North and the Elves in the wars against Sauron's forces in the North. With Sauron's defeat, the dwarves saw an opportunity to reclaim some of their lost glory and to rebuild their kingdoms. The Lonely Mountain, Erebor, and the Iron Hills became centers of dwarven power once again, and there was hope that the ancient halls of Khazad-dûm, now known as Moria, might one day be reclaimed. However, the dwarves also faced challenges in this new age. The decline of the elves, who had been both allies and occasional rivals, meant that the dwarves were left with fewer kindred spirits who understood the ancient ways and shared their long memories. The rise of men with their short lives and rapidly changing societies was something the dwarves viewed with both interest and caution. While they could see potential for new alliances and trade, they also recognized that the world was moving away from the older, more stable order that had existed for millennia. The dwarves, ever focused on their craft and their kin, began to withdraw even further into their mountain strongholds, becoming more reclusive as the world outside their halls changed. For the Ents, the ancient shepherds of the trees, Sauron's fall was a bittersweet victory as well. The Ents had played a crucial role in the War of the Ring, particularly in the destruction of Isengard and the defeat of Saruman, Sauron's ally. However, the victory came at a cost, for the Ents knew that their time was passing as well. The forests of Middle-earth were dwindling, and the Entwives whom the Ents had long sought were never found. The age of trees was ending, and with it, the age of the Ents. While they would continue to guard the forests that remained, the Ents knew that their numbers would dwindle, and one day they might become little more than a memory, like the great forests they once tended. The Astari, particularly Gandalf, also faced a new reality with the end of Sauron. The Astari, or wizards, had been sent to Middle-earth by the Valar to guide and assist the Free Peoples in their struggle against Sauron. With Sauron's defeat, their primary mission was complete. Gandalf, who had played a central role in orchestrating the resistance against Sauron, knew that his time in Middle-earth was drawing to a close. Unlike Saruman, who had been corrupted by his desire for power, Gandalf remained true to his purpose, guiding and aiding the peoples of Middle-earth without seeking dominion over them. With Sauron defeated, Gandalf's work was done, and he too prepared to leave Middle-earth. His departure, along with that of the Elves, marked the end of the presence of the Maiar in Middle-earth, signaling that the age of divine intervention in the affairs of Middle-earth was over. The most significant change brought about by Sauron's fall was the rise of men. Throughout the Second and Third Ages, men had been growing in power and influence, but they had often been overshadowed by the Elves, dwarves, and even the remnants of the Númenóreans, such as the Rangers of the North. The victory over Sauron, however, firmly established men as the dominant race in Middle-earth. The kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan, which had borne the brunt of the fighting in the War of the Ring, emerged as the new centers of power in the Fourth Age. Aragorn, now crowned King Elessar of Gondor, symbolized the unity and strength of men in this new age. His reign marked the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity for Gondor, which had been in decline for centuries. Aragorn's marriage to Arwen, the daughter of Elrond, also symbolized the union of the races of elves and men, though it was a final act of connection rather than the beginning of a new era of cooperation. With Arwen's choice to become mortal and live as a human, the last great tie between elves and men in Middle-earth was severed. As Aragorn's reign progressed, Gondor began to rebuild and expand its influence, restoring much of the greatness it had lost since the fall of Númenor. Rohan, under the leadership of King Éomer, also entered a period of renewal. The Rohirrim, who had fought valiantly against Sauron's forces, were celebrated as heroes, and their alliance with Gondor was strengthened in the years following the war. The fields of Rohan, once ravaged by war, were replanted and restored, and the kingdom thrived in the relative peace that followed Sauron's fall. Yet, even in Rohan, the sense of change was palpable. The Rohirrim, a people who had always valued their independence and connection to the land, were now part of a larger world, one where the influence of Gondor and the growing power of men could not be ignored. In the lands that had been under Sauron's direct control, particularly Mordor and its surrounding territories, the aftermath of his fall was complex. The land of Mordor, long a barren and twisted place, began to heal, though it would take many years for the scars of Sauron's presence to fade. The slaves and oppressed peoples who had lived under Sauron's yoke were freed, but they faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives in a land that had been ravaged by centuries of darkness and war. The remnants of Sauron's forces, including orcs and other creatures of darkness, either fled into the wilderness or were hunted down by the victorious armies of Gondor and its allies. The land itself, however, remained a harsh and desolate place, a reminder of the evil that had once dwelled there. The Easterlings and Southrons, who had allied with Sauron during the war, found themselves in a precarious position after his defeat. Their societies, which had been heavily influenced and supported by Sauron's power, were left in disarray. In the years that followed, some of these peoples attempted to forge new alliances with Gondor and Rohan, seeking to rebuild their lands and avoid retribution for their role in the war. Others, however, remained hostile, and conflicts continued on the borders of Gondor as these groups struggled to adapt to the New World Order. The defeat of Sauron did not mean the end of all conflict in Middle-earth, but it did signal a shift in the nature of that conflict. No longer was the world threatened by a single overwhelming force of darkness. Instead, it faced the more complex and multifaceted challenges of a world where men were the dominant race. The Shire, the homeland of the hobbits, was perhaps the only place in Middle-earth that seemed untouched by the larger forces at play. Yet even the Shire was affected by the fall of Sauron, though in more subtle ways. The return of Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, who had all played crucial roles in the defeat of Sauron, brought with it a new awareness among the hobbits of the wider world. The scouring of the Shire, during which the hobbits expelled the last remnants of Saruman's influence, was a direct consequence of the larger war, and it left the Shire with a newfound sense of self-reliance and strength. However, the return to peace and normalcy in the Shire was tinged with the awareness that the world outside their borders had changed dramatically. The hobbits, though largely content to return to their simple lives, could no longer ignore the fact that they were part of a much larger world, one that had been irrevocably altered by the fall of Sauron. In the broader context of Middle-earth, the end of Sauron's reign marked the end of the Third Age and the beginning of the Fourth Age, also known as the Age of Men. This new age was characterized by the decline of the old powers and the rise of new ones. The ancient lands and peoples of Middle-earth, which had once been the centers of power and culture, began to fade into the background as the kingdoms of men expanded and flourished. The elves and dwarves, though still present, became increasingly rare and reclusive, retreating into their hidden realms or leaving Middle-earth altogether. The great forests, mountains, and other ancient places of power became quiet and still, their secrets known only to a few. For the men of Middle-earth, the Fourth Age was a time of opportunity and challenge. With the fall of Sauron, they were free to shape their own destinies without the looming threat of an all-powerful Dark Lord. Yet this freedom also came with responsibility. The men of Gondor, Rohan, and other kingdoms had to navigate a world where the old boundaries and alliances were shifting. They had to build new societies, forge new alliances, and face new challenges that arose in the absence of the guiding presence of the Elves and the Maiar. The Fourth Age was a time of growth and change, but it was also a time of uncertainty, as the men of Middle-earth sought to find their place in a world that was still recovering from the long shadow of Sauron. In the end, the destruction of the One Ring and the fall of Sauron marked a turning point not just for the characters and kingdoms directly involved in the War of the Ring, but for the entire world of Middle-earth. It was the end of an era, the conclusion of the great struggles between light and darkness that had defined the First, Second, and Third Ages. The victory over Sauron was hard-won and celebrated, but it also came with the recognition that the world had changed irrevocably. The ancient races were fading, the old powers were waning, and the world was entering a new age, an age where men would be the stewards of Middle-earth's future, for better or worse. The destruction of the One Ring and the subsequent fall of Sauron marked the end of the Third Age and ushered in the Fourth Age, a period often referred to as the Age of Men. This new era brought with it significant changes for Middle-earth, as the influence of the ancient powers waned and the kingdoms of men rose to prominence. However, while the defeat of Sauron was a victory for the free peoples of Middle-earth, it was not without its costs, particularly for those who had played key roles in the struggle against him. Chief among these were Frodo Baggins and the other members of the Fellowship, whose fates were deeply intertwined with the final destruction of the ring. For Frodo Baggins, the destruction of the One Ring was both a triumph and a tragedy. He had carried the ring farther than anyone else, bearing its terrible burden all the way to Mount Doom. Yet the journey had left deep scars, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. The ring, with its insidious power to corrupt and destroy, had taken a heavy toll on Frodo. Even after it was destroyed, the memories of his journey and the burden of carrying the ring haunted him. The wound he had received from the Morgul blade on Weathertop never fully healed, and the darkness he had faced in Mordor left him with a deep sense of unease and melancholy. Frodo's return to the Shire was bittersweet. While his home had been saved from the ravages of Saruman and his ruffians, thanks in large part to Frodo and his companions, Frodo found that he could no longer find peace in the simple life he had once cherished. The experiences he had endured set him apart from the other hobbits, who could not fully understand the depth of his suffering or the magnitude of his sacrifice. Frodo became increasingly withdrawn, burdened by the weight of his memories and the lingering pain of his injuries. The Shire, once a place of comfort and safety, no longer felt like home to him. Despite the honors he received and the gratitude of his fellow hobbits, Frodo found that he could not escape the shadows of the past. He struggled with feelings of guilt and failure, particularly over his inability to destroy the ring himself. It was only through the intervention of Gollum that the ring was ultimately cast into the fires of Mount Doom, and Frodo could not shake the feeling that he had been saved by chance rather than his own strength of will. This burden weighed heavily on him, contributing to his sense of isolation and despair. As time passed, Frodo's condition did not improve. His physical health continued to deteriorate, and the mental and emotional scars of his journey grew more pronounced. He tried to find solace in writing down his experiences, preserving the story of the War of the Ring for future generations. Yet even this act of storytelling did not bring him the peace he sought. The memories of his journey, particularly the moments of greatest darkness, were too painful to revisit, and he struggled to find meaning in the life he had returned to. In the end, Frodo realized that he could no longer remain in Middle-earth. The land that had been his home for so long no longer held the peace and comfort it once had. He felt increasingly disconnected from the world around him, unable to fully participate in the life of the Shire. The wounds he had suffered, both physical and spiritual, were too deep to heal in Middle-earth. It was then that he accepted an offer that had been extended to him, a chance to sail into the West, to the Undying Lands, where he might find the healing and peace that eluded him in the mortal world. The Undying Lands, also known as Aman, were a realm beyond the reach of ordinary mortals, a place of eternal peace and beauty, where the Valar and the Elves who had never left it resided. For Frodo, this journey represented not just a physical voyage, but a spiritual release from the burdens he had carried for so long. Accompanied by Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, and his uncle Bilbo, Frodo boarded the ship at the Grey Havens, leaving Middle-earth behind. It was a poignant and bittersweet departure, marking the end of an era for the Shire and for all of Middle-earth. For Samwise Gamgee, Frodo's departure was particularly painful. Sam had been Frodo's closest companion and most loyal friend throughout the quest to destroy the ring. He had been with Frodo through every trial and had played a crucial role in ensuring the success of the mission. Yet, despite their deep bond, Sam knew that Frodo's journey had taken him to a place where he could not follow. The bond between them, forged in the fires of Mount Doom, was unbreakable, but it was also a bond that had to be severed for Frodo to find peace. Sam returned to the Shire with a heavy heart, but he also carried with him the strength and resilience that had seen him through the darkest days of their journey. He found solace in the love of his family and the work of rebuilding the Shire. Sam married Rosie Cotton, and together they had a large family, bringing new life and hope to the land they loved. Sam also took on a significant role in the Shire's community, becoming mayor and a respected leader. Yet, despite his outward happiness and success, the memory of Frodo's departure and the bond they shared remained with him always. Sam, like Frodo, was forever changed by his experiences. The journey to Mordor had revealed to him depths of courage and strength he had never known he possessed, but it had also shown him the darkness that lay at the heart of the world. While he was able to find happiness in his life in the Shire, he too carried the scars of the past. The knowledge of the sacrifices that had been made and the price that Frodo had paid stayed with him, shaping his understanding of the world and his place in it. For the other members of the Fellowship, the end of the War of the Ring brought different fates. Aragorn, now King Elessar, took up his role as the ruler of Gondor and Arnor, leading the reunited kingdom into a new era of peace and prosperity. His marriage to Arwen symbolized the union of the lines of elves and men, and under his rule, the lands of the West were restored and rebuilt. Aragorn's reign was long and just, and he became a figure of legend in his own time, but even he was not untouched by the sorrow of the past. The loss of his friends, particularly the departure of the elves and the passing of the old ways, weighed heavily on him as he grew older. Legolas, the elven prince of Mirkwood, and Gimli, the dwarf from the Lonely Mountain, continued their friendship long after the war had ended. Their bond, forged in the fires of battle and strengthened by mutual respect and admiration, was a symbol of the reconciliation between their two peoples, who had often been at odds in the past. Together, they traveled across Middle-earth, exploring its wonders and seeing the lands they had fought to protect. Yet, as the years passed, Legolas felt the call of the sea, the longing to return to the undying lands, which all elves eventually feel. When Aragorn passed away, Legolas finally heeded this call, building a ship and sailing into the west. Gimli, ever loyal to his friend, accompanied him, becoming the first dwarf to sail to the undying lands. Gandalf, the last of the Astari to remain in Middle-earth, departed alongside Frodo and the other ring-bearers. His task was complete, and with Sauron's defeat, his purpose in Middle-earth had been fulfilled. Gandalf's departure marked the end of the presence of the Maiar in Middle-earth, a sign that the world was now fully in the hands of men. With his departure, a sense of finality settled over Middle-earth. The age of divine intervention and ancient powers was over, and the Fourth Age truly began. The remaining members of the Fellowship, particularly Merry and Pippin, also found their places in the New World. Merry returned to Buckland and Pippin to Tuckborough, where they became influential leaders in the Shire. Their experiences in the War of the Ring had matured them, and they brought new perspectives and ideas to the Shire, helping to guide their people into the Fourth Age. Yet, like Frodo and Sam, they were forever changed by their experiences. The Shire was no longer just a quiet backwater. It was now a place that had been touched by the great events of the world, and Merry and Pippin carried the weight of that knowledge with them. As the Fourth Age progressed, the influence of the ancient races continued to fade. The Elves who remained in Middle-earth withdrew to their hidden realms, becoming increasingly reclusive. The Dwarves, while still active in their mountain kingdoms, became more focused on their own affairs, with less involvement in the broader world. The Ents, those ancient shepherds of the forest, slowly withdrew into the deep woods, where they were rarely seen by men. The magic and wonder of the old world, while not entirely gone, became less visible, hidden away in the remote and wild places of Middle-earth. In contrast, the realms of men flourished. Under the leadership of Aragorn and his successors, Gondor and its allies rebuilt and expanded their influence. The cities and lands that had been ravaged by war were restored and new settlements were founded. Trade and commerce grew, and a new sense of optimism took root in the hearts of the people. The shadow of Sauron was gone, and with it, the constant fear and uncertainty that had plagued Middle-earth for so long. Yet, even in this time of renewal, the lessons of the past were not forgotten. The memory of the War of the Ring and the sacrifices that had been made remained a powerful influence on the peoples of Middle-earth. The tale of Frodo and the Fellowship was told and retold, becoming a legend that inspired future generations. The importance of vigilance, the dangers of unchecked power, and the value of friendship and loyalty became central themes in the cultures of men, shaping their societies and guiding their leaders. The hobbits, who had played such a crucial role in the defeat of Sauron, largely returned to their quiet rural lives. The Shire remained a place of peace and tranquility, but it was also a place where the memory of the past was carefully preserved. The Red Book of Westmarch, written by Frodo and later added to by Sam, became a treasured document, recording the history of the War of the Ring and the experiences of those who had lived through it. The hobbits of the Fourth Age knew that their small land had played a part in great events, and they took pride in the bravery and resilience of their people. As the years passed, the memory of the great events of the Third Age began to fade, becoming the stuff of legend and myth. The stories of Sauron, the One Ring, and the Fellowship of the Ring were passed down through the generations, but as the world changed and new challenges arose, they became more distant, less immediate. The elves, dwarves, and other ancient races became figures of legend, their existence increasingly questioned by those who had never seen them. The magic and wonder of the old world receded into the background, overshadowed by the more practical concerns of the growing kingdoms of men. Yet the legacy of Sauron's fall endured. The lessons learned during the War of the Ring continued to shape the world of men, influencing their decisions and actions. The importance of unity in the face of evil, the dangers of greed and ambition, and the value of courage and sacrifice remained central themes in the cultures of Middle-earth. The New Age was one of men, but it was built on the foundation of the past, with the memories of those who had come before, providing guidance and wisdom. For those who had lived through the War of the Ring, the transition to the Fourth Age was a time of reflection and adjustment. They had seen the world change in profound ways, and they had played a part in shaping that change. As they grew older, many of them found themselves increasingly nostalgic for the days of the past, even as they worked to build a better future. The experiences of the Third Age had left an indelible mark on their souls, shaping their identities and their understanding of the world. In the end, the destruction of the One Ring was not just the end of Sauron's power, it was the end of an era. The world of Middle-earth would never be the same, and the characters who had played such a central role in that world would never forget the journey they had undertaken. The Fourth Age was a time of hope and renewal, but it was also a time of loss and change, as the ancient powers faded and the world moved on. The story of Frodo, the Fellowship, and the War of the Ring became a legend that would endure for generations, a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had saved Middle-earth from darkness.